Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chief. Good morning. We are here this morning to review the President's request for the Forest Service for fiscal year 2017. Chief Tidwell, it is good to be able to welcome you back to the committee. Appreciate you being here to explain the President's proposal. It's probably not going to be a surprise to you. I'm not enamored with it. In fact, I've got some issues with several aspects of it. I'll just mention a couple of them this morning in my opening. We do have several proposals here within the budget, a number of mandatory spending proposals without providing offsets. And I have mentioned this as other members of the Cabinet have come before us, that when we have mandatory spending proposals with no offsets, that is problematic. The Secure Rural Schools Program, SRS, is clearly an example of that. We've reached a point where if we're not cutting trees on federal lands, and we hardly are, then counties, parishes, and boroughs are going to be cutting their budgets, and that's not acceptable. The timber industry can be sustainable, but the funding required for SRF without offsets and in the absence of timber harvesting is not. We have many communities around the country, particularly in the West, that are dependent economically on the active management of our national forests. As you know, Southeast Alaska is full of such communities, and this is not a budget that they're going to find appealing. On the Tongass, the Secretary of Agriculture has directed the Forest Service to expedite a transition away from old-growth timber harvesting towards a timber program focused on predominantly young growth. We know that this is a secretarial mandate, and it will fundamentally change the way the Tongass is managed, but there is no mention of the transition in this budget to explain how it will be executed and how it will be funded. And yet, that doesn't stop the Forest Service from moving on a plan amendment to lock in this transition before this administration leaves office. I think that the Forest Service needs to do what's right and what the Tongass Advisory Committee called for in its recommendations, and that's a comprehensive stand-level inventory to address the uncertainties that exist in the amount, volume, and timing of the availability of young growth to support a transition. But a successful transition will only be possible if it's grounded in strong science and backed by comprehensive data. And as a starting point, as a matter of common sense, really, we need a complete inventory before we allow a plan amendment to move forward. In the meantime, it's critical that the Forest Service provide enough timber to meet market demand, because if you don't do that, and we've had this conversation so many times, if we don't do that, there isn't any industry left to transition to. Another issue that I know that we will hear a lot of discussion about this morning is how this budget proposes to address wildfire. Again, the Forest Service budget asks Congress to fund just 70% of the 10-year average of suppression costs. A proposed cap adjustment would pay for the remaining 30%, as well as any costs above the 10-year average. This idea has been rejected every year since it was first proposed in the FY 2015 budget. There just isn't agreement here in Congress on whether or how to address what this proposal is aimed at, the growth of fire programs as a percentage of the Forest Service annual budget. But what we do agree on, and I think you will probably hear it echoed from all of us this morning, what we agree on is putting an end to the unsustainable practice of fire borrowing. We know that we cannot continue to fight fires by diverting funds from other parts of the Forest Service budget, and we agree with you there. And that's why last year we worked so hard to include wildfire provisions in the omnibus, and I think that they were proposals that were responsible and they were pragmatic. It included $1.6 billion for fire suppression, which is $600 million above the average cost of fighting wildfire over the past 10 years. It included $545 million for hazardous fuels reduction, and it also includes $360 million for the Forest Service Timber Program, which will help us begin to resume active management of our forests. So barring a truly record-setting fire season this year, fire borrowing should not be an issue for the rest of this fiscal year. And that gives us some time here to advance legislation that addresses wildfire budgeting and how we manage our forests. And we need to do both at once, because we know the wildfire problem is not just a budgeting problem, it's also a management problem. High upfront costs, long planning horizons, and regulatory requirements, including what seem like an unending environmental review process, are impeding our ability to implement treatments at the pace and the scale that wildfires are occurring. We must also work with our state agencies, local communities, and the public to increase community preparedness and install fire breaks to break up fuel connectivity to keep fires small. As you know, we've got a vested interest in my state to make sure that we're doing this right. About half of the 10 million acres that burned in last year's fire season were in Alaska. We've already had our second wildfire this year in the state. This is March 8th, and we've already had our second. So know, Chief, that I'm eager to work with you as well as the other members of this committee and other committees that have a role on this issue. I know that we all agree that we've got some real challenges here that will only grow worse if we fail to address them. So look forward to working with you to address these challenges and others. With that, I'll turn to Senator